Greetings, friends around the world. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible News Prophecy Channel. Should Christians pay taxes? Why do the descendants of Israel pay them anyway? And are taxes inevitable? In the United States, one of the biggest bites on our income is taxes. There are state taxes, federal income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, and other taxes. And in some countries, such as certain ones in Europe, the taxes are higher. In nations around the world, taxes are important means of financing government and providing certain services for the people. In many places, taxes are assessed based on a percentage of income, generally increasing on the percent goes up on the scale. Now, despite taxes, many governments are falling further and further behind and increasing their debt. Then they usually resort to increasing taxes again. History shows that taxes occurred in places such as ancient Egypt, Persia, Greece, Rome. The famous Rosetta Stone mentions taxes on grain and wine. Humankind has suffered taxation throughout history, and much of this is a consequence of rejecting God's government. But of course, taxes themselves are lesser of the many evils that humans have suffered because of this rejection. Now, back in 1981, there's an interesting article in the Old Plain Truth magazine that was published. I'm going to read from this. It says, "Tax time, as one poet called it, is the cruelest month. While you're thinking of taxes, ask yourself how God views them, and then realize God has something far better. Nothing is so certain, so the saying goes, as death and taxes. Don't be so sure. Taxes are not eternal. In the world tomorrow, man's taxing system will be junked, replaced by God's tithing system that's been enforced from the beginning of human life, but of which most people know little or nothing. There are big differences between taxes and tithing. Man's system of taxation is progressive. That means the percentage goes up as your income goes up. So let me give you an example. Let's say you make $20,000 and the tax rate is, let's say, 10%. So you would pay $2,000. Well, in an income, that would be what you do in a tithing system. In a tax system, let's say it's the same, but let's say somebody makes $200,000. Well, in the tithing system, that person would pay 10% of $200,000, which would be $20,000. But in human progressive income tax, you're probably talking the person is going to pay between $60,000 and $80,000 because the percentage of taxes goes up as the income goes up. Now again, I'm reading from this article. God's system is far more intelligent. It's a flat percentage system. The word tithe means tenth. A tithe of anything is a tenth part of it. It's a constant proportion. It's based on the fact that God owns all, but only claims a small part of the increase produced in the earth which He created. Tithing is a system totally without respect to persons. It treats high-income earners the same as the poor. The progressive system is based on envy of the more wealthy. It deals with people unequally depending on their income. The tithing system is neutral toward who you are. Keep it simple. Many, if not most people, get help filling out their income tax returns. Why is man's system so complicated? Almost all the complexity in our tax system, believe it or not, stems from one thing: progressive rates. Well, that may have been true back in '81, but there's more reasons for it now. Because men did not model their tax structure after God's tithing system, they fall into suffocating confusion. High-income earners, because of progressive rates, go through incredible exertions, hire lawyers and all that kind of stuff. God's financing system is different. It doesn't encourage young workers to live single together. 10% is 10%. It doesn't discriminate in favor or against people based on their marital status. Man's system further encourages a borrowing to get it now attitude. American tax laws, for example, allow you to deduct interest from the income in which you pay taxes. This plus progressive rates mean that a higher income person is almost forced to go out and borrow as much as he can, keep out of the jaws of the high tax bracket. Well, I should add that's changed a little bit too. They've got some restrictions on that, but this next part is true. God's system, and still current, relevant. God's system is so much saner. The decision to borrow money is made on its own merits. Because of the flat rate, the tithing system doesn't affect it one way or the other, and it certainly doesn't give anybody an incentive to buy something on credit just to be buying it, as does man's tax system. Similarities. Of course, there's some similarities between God's system, tithing system, and man's tax system. Both taxes and tithes take precedent over other debts. In American law, for example, a tax collector gets his money first, even before God, and certainly before any other creditors get theirs, if you can't pay all your debts. And according to the biblical law, tithing is what you owe God, the debt you owe God. In the world tomorrow, the tithing system will completely replace man's tax system. There'll be no more complicated rules on capital gains, no more desperate attempts to be taxed at a lower rate. And it's true, in societies such as the American one, taxes are not simple. As a matter of fact, they're so complicated that the tax authorities don't actually know what the rules are. And if you actually call the federal tax authorities, one, sometimes they don't know the answer. And secondly, even if they do give you an answer, legally, you don't totally rely on it. The government will say, it doesn't matter that one tax person told you, we've interpreted it differently. So this is bizarre, as far as I'm concerned. Interestingly, Jesus chastised the lawyers of his day for imposing heavy burdens on the people. You can look that up in Luke 11, verse 46. Modern tax laws are excessively complicated burden. Well, should Christians comply anyway? Well, what did Jesus teach about taxes? Well, actually, Jesus taught people are supposed to pay their taxes. If you go to the book of Mark, chapter 12, starting in verse 14, people came up to him and said, "Teacher, we know that you are true and care about no one, for you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay?" But he, Jesus, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, "Why do you test me? Bring me a denarius that I may see it." So they brought it. And he said to them, "Whose image and inscription is this?" They said to him, "Caesar's." And Jesus answered and said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God." And they marveled at him. So we see Jesus said you're supposed to pay taxes. Actually, in the book of Matthew, chapter 17, there was taxes came up another time. And so Matthew 17, starting in verse 24, says, when they had come to Capernaum, those who received the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher pay the temple tax?" And he said, "Yes." And when he came to his house, Jesus anticipated him, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take customs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers?" Verse 26, Peter said to him, "From strangers." Jesus said to them, "Then the sons are free. Nevertheless, lest we offend them, go to the sea, cast in a hook, take out the fish that comes up first. You've opened its mouth, you'll find a piece of money. Take that and give it to them for me and you." So Jesus paid taxes even though he felt he was exempt for this particular one. And we're supposed to pay taxes whether or not we think we're supposed to be exempt. Now the Apostle John, in 1 John 2, verse 6, taught, "He who says he abides in him ought himself also to walk just as he walked." Thus, Christians should pay taxes. Now Ron Kelly wrote about Jesus and taxes, and he said that there had been a tax revolt, or some kind of tax revolts from time to time amongst the Jews, and he feels that's the reason why in Mark 12 that I read, and the same stories in Matthew 22, that they asked Jesus if they should pay taxes. And he felt, correctly I'm sure, that if Jesus spoke against paying taxes, they could turn him over to the Roman officials for his rebellion against the law. And if he said he favored it, he could be viewed as holding pro-Roman feelings. But Jesus just said, show the coin. We'll go from there. The Roman government, right or wrong, this is from Ron Kelly, had the authority to collect taxes. Jesus did not justify a tax revolt. If Caesar demanded a tax, then the tax was to be paid. But Jesus was careful to point out one must not neglect his duty to God while fulfilling one's tax obligations to the state. On another occasion, Jesus commented on tithing. And tithing was the means that God has been using since at least the time of Abraham. But the Jews were very strict about it. And to address this is Matthew 23:23, and this is from the Old King James Version, or the Authorized Version. "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth or a tithe of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." So basically, they spent a lot of time counting their grains to make sure they're giving their 10%. But Jesus said that tithing was an important obligation. You weren't supposed to neglect it. There were other more important things they were supposed to do, or at least as important things to do, such as mercy, justice, and faith. After the Jews were in Babylonian captivity and they came back, they seemed to have a problem sometimes with tithing. And Ron Kelly, again quoting from the Old King James Version, Malachi 3:8-10, wrote, "Will a man rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how do we rob you? In tithes and offerings. You're under a curse, the whole nation of you, because you're robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you will not have room enough for it. Tithing was never meant to be a burden. This is from Ron Kelly. Frankly, taxation can be, but the government where you live will insist you pay taxes, and while you may not always cheerfully do so, it's an obligation you have for living in your country. And taxes are something that Christians are supposed to pay for now. Now, ancient Israel had an issue which ended up giving them additional taxes. They had originally accepted the government of God and had Moses and then prophets and other ones who led them for a while. Well, they decided that wasn't what they wanted. They wanted to be like everyone else. So in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 8, we hear, starting in verse 4, "And all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, 'Look, you're old and your sons don't walk in your ways. Now let us make a king to judge us like the nations.'" So they asked for a king, and Samuel wasn't pleased with this. Then God said to Samuel in verse 7 to take heed in all they say. They haven't rejected you, but they rejected me. Cutting down to verse 9. "Now therefore heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show the behavior of the king that will reign after them." Starting in verse 10. "So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked for a king. Then he said, 'This will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s, and some to plow his ground, some to reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots.'" So he's going to have a government. He's going to hire people or draft them. "He'll take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers." Verse 14. "And he will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves and give them to his servants." So that's one tax. Verse 15. "He'll take a tenth of your grain, your vintage, and give it to his officers and servants. He'll take your male servants, female servants, your finest young men, donkeys. He'll take a tenth of your sheep, and you'll be his servants. And you'll cry out in the day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourself. And the Lord will not hear you in that day." And taxes have gone up since. So we have a greater tax burden than then. But we see that because people decided to disobey God, that this type of taxation system was imposed on the descendants of the children of Israel. Tax records have gone back for a long time. I mentioned Rosetta Stone. Back in 2012, they found some tax records under King Manasseh, of Judah's King Manasseh. So we've got records that the taxes went for a long time. But the paperwork and the burden of reporting taxes in the United States is close to unbearable, by the way, if you happen to own a business here. It's making more and more difficult for American businesses to exist, especially small ones, especially if they do anything overseas. It's so complicated that tax authorities don't actually seem to know the rules. If you own a small business and you hire, let's say, 3 or 4 people, and you pay them a couple times a month, you've got, at least 4 tax payments you have to make every month. So, and related forms, so that's 4 times 12, that's 48. Plus you have to do regular taxes, so that's at least 50 returns that you have to do. Plus if you sell anything, you have sales taxes. The tax burden in the United States and the paperwork burden, reporting burden, is getting pretty high. Now some feel that the U.S. Constitution doesn't allow for taxes, and that they shouldn't have to pay them, and that taxes are supposed to be voluntary and all this kind of stuff. Well, the reality is, irrespective of what the Constitution seems to say in plain English, it also says that the courts are the ones who are determining constitutionality, and the courts have ruled that the tax system is legal, whether or not you think it is, what it says in the Constitution. And I realize that it's called a voluntary system, and we all know what the English word voluntary is supposed to mean, but in the United States and many other governments, but definitely the United States, voluntary means that you voluntarily fill out the form on your own, or have somebody do it, and voluntarily submit it, or some other piece of paper, by April 15th. And if you don't voluntarily do this, by the way, you're subject to government authorities, including police powers, to enforce this. So it's not truly voluntary in the sense you don't have a choice. You do have a choice. The government considers it, though, voluntary because you're basically reporting about yourself. But the reality is, whether you think it's constitutional or not, it is the law of the land in the United States, and the law of the land in many other lands, the people who are going to be viewing this, are that you have to pay taxes. Now, it's very likely in Jesus' time, people felt they had legal arguments why they shouldn't have to pay to Caesar. But as it says in Mark 12:17, you're supposed to render to Caesar what's Caesar's, and to God what's God's. So Christians do need to pay their taxes. Yes, the time is going to come when Jesus will establish the kingdom of God, the government of God on the earth. There'll be no more improper, unfair taxes at that time. And when He establishes that kingdom, we won't have this complicated tax burden that we now have in the paperwork and all that, but instead we'll have a tithing-based system. But until then, Christians should pay their taxes as well as their tithes. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible News Prophecy Channel.